Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Bears Pod with Parker Hurley. This is your host, Parker Hurley. It's Tuesday at 6 o'clock. As always, we're going to be here Tuesday at 6 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock Central. If you didn't listen to my last episode, like I said, we were doing Tuesdays and Thursdays. We're going to continue doing Tuesdays and Thursdays during the regular season. We're just going to do Tuesdays from now until training camp, or at least until some more Chicago Bears news comes. So everybody hit like, hit subscribe, leave your comments if you want to dictate where we're going with this chat. And basically the reality is that the reason we're going weekly is we're finishing up the draft talk, and then there's going to be some OTA talks, but then that's going to be, slim pickings and everything like that. And then we're going to get into the dead of the offseason, which is when I'm going to start getting into the meaty roster review and things like that. And basically every player on the roster, we'll go through the depth chart. We'll pick out a couple facts from each player. We'll dig through some competitions. We'll dig through some depth chart talk and stuff like that. So we're going to finish up the draft talk today. Then we'll be back next Tuesday, and then we'll be kicking it every Tuesday until things start really heating up for the NFL. So it's summertime. It's NFL draft time. It's over now, but like I said, was trying to get some more time to watch all of these prospects for the Chicago Bears. Was able to get more Tyrique Stevenson in, but wasn't able to get as much Tyrique Stevenson. There just wasn't. It's hard to get college all 22 video unless you can watch it on YouTube, but especially for cornerbacks, it gets really hard. And there just wasn't as much Tyrique Stevenson as I wanted to see. I was able to see more and able to get a firmer confirmation, I think, on some of my opinions on Tyrique Stevenson. So we'll break into that. I got to see a little bit more about Terrell Smith. And actually, maybe some of the thoughts are, maybe I'm a little bit concerned about Terrell Smith and what he can do in the NFL. So we'll talk about the cornerbacks and how they fit, and some rookie expectations for some of those guys. But if you do have anything else you want to talk about, definitely leave that in the chat. And definitely first I'm going to talk about Tyrique Stevenson, who, in my opinion, I think the first thought that I took away from him is I think for sure he's a better zone cornerback than a man cornerback. I think one of the nice realities of Tyrique Stevenson is that he has experience in zone and man. He's played the left, right, slot. And one of the questions or issues is that he was a five-star recruit, went to Georgia, started in the slot, or was kind of in that Minka Fitzpatrick at Alabama in that slot star, inside linebacker almost type of role for Georgia as a freshman, because they had so many, I want to say Tyson Campbell, and maybe Eric Stokes were probably the two guys on the outside, at that point in time for a guy like Tyrique Stevenson. So those are, NFL players. He was just a freshman. He's playing in the slot. They're moving him into that slot full-time role, and that is a valuable role in the NFL. But he told the Georgia coaches that he wanted to play outside. They moved him to the outside, or they didn't move him to the outside. So he transferred to Miami, and he got to play 2 seasons on the outside. So you can say he played both sides, like I said, so that's fine. Some cornerbacks only do stick to their left side, like Jalen Johnson, typically stays to his one side. So you'd assume Tyrique will stay to his side, but he's played both sides and he's played in the slot, although I wouldn't expect him to play much slot for the Chicago Bears, as mentioned, for those reasons. He was able to play both man and zone in Miami, but those are some of the reasons where I feel more confident in his upside as a zone cornerback versus a man cornerback, and I think you see it in his athletic testing when you look at his 3-cone wasn't nearly the best and his 20 shuttle wasn't nearly the best, because his agilities are when you have to kind of bend your body and when you have to change directions, he can be a little stiff-hipped, and he doesn't have quite the movement skills, and a lot of it came on like double moves and things like that. When he bites on one move and he has to change direction, turn his entire upper body, and then run with receivers, he has the athletic traits to catch up with receivers down the field. But when they run the double moves and when they run especially in breaking routes, you can see his hips. When he opens up his hips, he can start to get tight and he can be steps behind, and that's where he can start to give up catches. One of the biggest games, if you want to see him struggle, especially with double moves, is North Carolina. But also, and you see especially a guy like Josh Downs, and you see, okay, that's a really shifty slot wide receiver, but he really gave Tyrique those troubles, and he really exposed his hips in that regard. But some of the game in that North Carolina game that you could see is that he has pretty good zone instincts overall, and he's able to pass off routes and things like that. And he is, especially when he is able to he's not that great in press. He's pretty good in press, but he can, when he's able to play off coverage, keep his eyes on the cornerback, and he does have that ability to, when he needs to click and close on those receivers, and he's able to come at them heavily. He's a feisty cornerback. He's willing to tackle, and that's where I think he's a good zone cornerback, when he can read, make plays on the ball, and come downhill charging at the receivers. I think he's pretty good when he has to follow receivers who are, making double moves and making inside moves and making him open up his hip and expose his hips. He can start to get steps behind, and at times he has recovery speed, but a lot of the time what you see with his recovery speed is he starts to get really grabby, and that's where you start to say, okay, is Tyrique Stevenson going to start to commit penalties in the NFL? And one of the things that I kind of noted is, like I kind of said, okay, if you would more of compare him to a cornerback, it is Jalen Johnson versus Kyler Gordon, and it has some fans saying, Jalen Johnson's due a contract at the end of this season. Are they potentially moving on from Jalen Johnson? And then Tyrique Stevenson's the bigger, maybe stiffer cornerback. And those are some of the traits that Johnson carries, versus Gordon is a little bit smaller. He's a little bit, he's not as physical, but he is able to, with those shiftier routes, those quicker routes, he is able to, run with those, like I said, the Josh Downs type of receivers, those slot type of receivers. Could it be that those are their two cornerbacks moving forward? I look at it as NFL teams in today's NFL, you need three cornerbacks in the NFL. You need, I was talking about the Seattle Seahawks. Now, look at their receiver core. They have DK Metcalf, they have Tyler Lockett, and they have Jackson Smith and Jigba. Like, you can't just come out with just any third cornerback who's just your third cornerback, because you're going to get cooked all game long. And even when you look at the Dallas Cowboys, you say, who is it? CD, what's his name? CD Brandon Cooks they just traded for, and CD Brandon Cooks they just traded for, and Michael Gallup. So you look at those guys, you need three cornerbacks in today's NFL. And even if you're like the Eagles and it's Zach Ertz as your third receiver, even if you're the 49ers and it's George Kittle as your third receiver, you need three cornerbacks. So I don't see where they're just pushing one of those guys out. And we got a comment here from Zach Powers. He says he's caught some shows after the fact and good to catch you live. Thank you, Zach. And like I kind of said before, and I do want to mention, if you are listening after the fact, leave some comments in the comment section, and that'll be the first thing that I talk about on the very next podcast. So always want to talk about what you guys want to talk about. So definitely wanted to thank you, Zach, for the comment, and definitely wanted to remind everybody that if you do have some comments, and like he said, he likes to catch the show after I'm recording. If you are listening after the recording, leave some comments, because some of the best debates are coming, in the comments section or after the fact. And there was some good Gervon Dexter discussion from our last episode. Really good stuff from both sides. People pessimistic, people optimistic, people understanding my point of view, where I'm higher than other people, and saying it's not shown yet, but what you can see is there's still some upside. And that's where I'm saying with Tyrique Stevenson is maybe there isn't as much upside. Maybe it is more of what you see is what you get with him, in terms of, we're going to wonder about how good he is in terms of his zone instincts, or in terms of his man ability. But like I said, you need three cornerbacks here. And the reality is that Kyler Gordon last season, whether he was bad due to the pass rush, he struggled last season, and he had to play both the outside and the slot. And they thought that was one of the reasons why they thought he was so valued as a second-round pick, is that he could do both. Turned out he couldn't do both, at least in his rookie season. So in my opinion, I think that they're just seeing it as, and I think the Chicago Bears are going to be one of the most zone-heavy defensive secondaries in the NFL next season. Because when you look at it, we're going to get into it with the cornerbacks. Jalen Johnson is his stats in zone versus man are completely drastic. He's so much better in zone. When you look at just the traits, and people can look at some of the stats, and Tyrique doesn't have the best stats in zone because of some of the double moves and things of that nature. But like I said, when he plays off coverage in zone, I think this in the stats in college football tend to be flawed based on, a lot of things, and it's just a different sport, based on the hashes are so much further apart. It just changes the game altogether. And like I said, the better athletes win a lot more in college football. And there's not, the better athletes just don't win as much in the NFL, because they're all the better athletes. If you're not a good athlete, you don't make it in the NFL. And that's where Tyrique Stevenson, we're going to see where he is. But like I said, him and Jalen Johnson both fit as they're both tall, they're both long, they're both pretty thick overall. They both love to play physical bully, style of football. And then Kyler Gordon is kind of the exact opposite, and that's why, in my opinion, I think they just stick him in the slot and they play zone heavy on the outside, and they can do what they want and mix and match on the inside with the linebackers. They're going to be linebacker heavy with TJ Edwards and then Kyler Gordon. So it is, in my opinion, it's going to be a demotion for Kyler Gordon, because I do think there could be a competition between Gordon and Tyrique Stevenson in training camp. But I think by the end of the season, they're going to want to see Tyrique Stevenson to have progressed to that point where he's going to start. And so Kyler Gordon goes from last season, he was 100% of the snaps. Now he's going to be that, you still play your nickel about 75% of the time. Kyler Gordon will play about 75% of the time, but he's going from 100 to probably 75 because I think Tyrique is going to be in there. So one of the other things I did look into is there's a ton of cornerbacks who were drafted since 2011 in that second round range where Tyrique Stevenson was drafted. I highlighted some of the best ones and said, okay, if Tyrique Stevenson wants to have a good rookie season, or he wants to be on track with some of these rookies, what are some of the statistics that we should be looking for? Some of the best second round cornerbacks since 2011 include Casey Hayward, Ronald Darby, James Bradbury, Carlton Davis, Dante Jackson, Trayvon Diggs, Jalen Johnson, and Asante Samuel. So if he wants to be on a list that, a lot of these guys, when you actually break it down, they all tend to have pretty similar statistics at the end of the day. So they all averaged about 500 snaps, 43 or 44 catches on about 74 targets, and that amounted to about 567 yards, and about 4 touchdowns and about 2 to 3 interceptions is what you could expect is from Tyrique Stevenson. The most touchdowns allowed, Trayvon Diggs allowed 6 touchdowns in his rookie season. So if you do see 6 touchdowns allowed, but what you do have to notice is that Trayvon Diggs also had 3 interceptions and 12 pass breakups. So if you see a high amount of, touchdowns allowed from Tyrique Stevenson as a rookie, you're going to want to see that compounded with the fact that there are pass breakups. And even Jalen Johnson, the Chicago Bears rookie, gave up 5 touchdowns and had no interceptions, but he had 13 pass breakups, and he was one of the best in terms of yards per snap allowed. And one of the more interesting things that you actually look at when you see all these cornerbacks is that Bradbury, Davis, Dante Jackson, and Asante Samuel are the only ones who didn't have 10 pass breakups. So, Diggs had 12, Jalen Johnson had 13, Darby had 15, Hayward had 12. And then even when you look at Asante had 7, Bradbury had 6. So what you're seeing is that these cornerbacks, even some of them, the yards are a little higher, some of them, the yards are a little bit lower, but for the majority of these players, they're getting their hands on the football, and they're getting on the field as rookies. So one, if Tyrique Stevenson doesn't get on the field, there's not a track record of second round picks who don't get on the field as rookies, just usually tend to struggle, especially at the cornerback position where, it's a young man's sport and you got to make or break on that rookie contract. So all those guys tended to get on the field, and all those guys were getting their hands on the football, maybe not in terms of interceptions, but I mean, Casey Hayward had 6 interceptions. Dante Jackson had 4 interceptions. And even like I said, Jalen Johnson had 0 interceptions. He had 13 pass breakups. Carlton Davis actually had 0 interceptions and only 2 pass breakups, but he was by far the lowest in yards per coverage snap allowed. So any of these cornerbacks and the rest of these cornerbacks that you tend to look at from the second round, weren't hits or didn't go on to second contracts. And that is kind of since 2011 the main list that you want to look at. So we're going to come back to next year around this time. And I have 2 articles where I think when, by this time it is almost obvious, but I have 2 articles where I looked at Jaquan Brisker and Kyler Gordon. I highlighted last season, I said, what would the expectations be of Kyler Gordon? I came up with obviously similar names because they were both second round picks. And Kyler Gordon failed to meet expectations. He gave up like 800 yards. He just isn't. He's like 130 yards off of anybody on this list, Kyler Gordon was. So it is hard to even, like I said, you could say, oh, well, the pass rush, this and that. I mean, Carlton Davis was on a pretty bad Buccaneers team, and he did just fine, and they were throwing away from him. For the Chicago Bears, they were throwing at Kyler Gordon because Jalen Johnson was, a pretty good cornerback, and Gordon was the weakness on the team. So even if you want to say, could Kyler Gordon progress this, that, the other? Yes, but I think you have to still take away that rookie season and say the pass rush wasn't good, but I'm still pretty leery overall about it. And that is where, so Kyler Gordon didn't meet expectations. And then I looked at Jaquan Brisker. I mean, far and away, I think everybody knows he beat expectations. And I mean, I'm talking about in tackles, blew it out of the water, tackles for loss, blew it out of the water, sacks, blew it out of the water, passes defense way above, and really, way above guys that, I mentioned were Javon Holland and Landon Collins, were I think two of the best former second round pick safeties, especially box safeties like Jaquan Brisker. And Jaquan Brisker's rookie season statistically was so much better than both of theirs. And even, some of the things there was, I think it was like tackles for loss in, it might have been interceptions, was like, because he only had one interception, was the same as a guy like Javon Holland. But when he had like 4.5 sacks and Holland only had like 2, and he had more tackles for loss, and he had like 20 more tackles than Javon Holland. And now people do look at Javon Holland as one of the best safeties in the NFL. I think you could walk away. And that's why I do these studies. I think you could walk away saying, okay, plenty of second round cornerbacks since in the past 12 years, past 11 years, plenty of them were drafted by teams with bad pass rushes, and still none of them were as bad as Kyler Gordon. On the flip side, plenty of safeties in the second round were drafted, and not many were as good as Jaquan Brisker. So, you kind of, and like I said, it was obvious when you looked at it. And I mean, I didn't even have to do a Velus Jones post because he wasn't even close to, and when you look at the third round picks at wide receivers, you say, how many third round wide receivers had as bad of a rookie season as Velus Jones did and went on to be anything? And the list just gets so small. And that's where you start to realize, like, even there has to be more glimpses than what you saw from Velus Jones. And it's same with Kyler Gordon. There just weren't enough glimpses for you to look around and say, oh, it was just because of the pass rush. Oh, it was just because of this for Velus Jones. And that's why they drafted, somebody like Tyler Scott. And that's why Velus Jones will like move to, around the 5th type of person. And as we transition here, if you got any comments, if you want to talk about where we're going here, I will talk about my concerns with Terrell Smith and why I still don't think the addition of Tyrique Stevenson means that they're going to push out Jalen Johnson. And a lot of people think, oh, well, what it means is, they also drafted Terrell Smith, and it's going to take Terrell Smith one season as that backup cornerback. And then by the next season, he'll be starting, and they'll move on from Jalen Johnson, and it'll be Terrell Smith and Tyrique Stevenson and Kyler Gordon. And I mean, that's an awesome thought on draft weekend. That sounds really great on draft weekend. And then you start to break it down, and you just wonder, Kyler Gordon or Terrell Smith, I think there is potential for upside. There's definitely a willingness to tackle, which, the one question is he didn't play special teams, despite the fact that he got benched in 2019, which is concerning in my opinion. And the other thing is that when you just look at him, his season was fine, but it wasn't, and it was better than all of his other seasons, but it wasn't this, stellar season where he was making all kinds of plays. And some of, his plays on the ball were poor quarterback play in the Big Ten. And, he played almost exclusively in zone coverage. I have the stats here. He had in the past 2 seasons, Terrell Smith has 65 snaps in man coverage, and he has 337 snaps in zone coverage. And on 65 snaps in man coverage, he gave up 177 yards, so 2.72 yards per snap in man coverage, and then 0.94 in zone coverage. So, yeah, we got Zach Powers here saying Kyler Gordon is pretty small, isn't he? I vaguely remember him coming out, and that is the fact where both Tyrique Stevenson and Jalen Johnson are over 6 foot. They're both like 190 plus, whereas Kyler Gordon is like 5'10", 180, and he's the one that, like I said, they both have, like a 7'1" in their agility and their 3 cones, Jalen Johnson and Tyrique, whereas Kyler Gordon is like a 6'8" agility type of player, where that's where I say they're just so different stylistically. And it sounded great. And I mean, one of the interesting things that I'm tending to pick up is Matt Eberflus not wanting to recreate the Indianapolis Colts defense, but he drafted specific players for the Colts defense to fit his scheme. And now he's trying to draft specific players for the Chicago Bears defense to fit his scheme. And what he really Kyler Gordon fits very comparably to Kenny Moore in the Colts defense, or that's what he would like in a dream scenario. He would be his Kenny Moore. And Kenny Moore is really, he earns all pro honors and things of that nature because Kenny Moore can play the outside. And then when it comes down to it, he's probably the best slot cornerback in the NFL, but he can handle himself on the outside. And that's what Matt Eberflus wanted from Kyler Gordon. And that is not what he got in his rookie season. And I think he drafted Tyrique, because he's saying that, one of the Colts' better times are when they had, somebody like Rocky Sin and Stephon Gilmore, someone like, some of those bigger cornerbacks on the outside, and you can push Isaiah Rodgers on the outside, and you can push Kenny Moore into being more of a full-time slot. And I think that's what he wants to be with Tyrique Stevenson. And that's what he says is give Kyler Gordon a short leash with Tyrique Stevenson at his heels, and he will take his spot, and he slips up. And that's exactly how I see it. And that's how there's always going to be competition. And in training camp, they're always going to have that competition. But, especially if they're going to run zone heavy, and especially if Kyler Gordon, so you run zone heavy on the outside, and Kyler Gordon can man up on those slot cornerbacks on the inside. So then you can run different looks and things like that. That's where I think it almost makes, like I said, it takes away value from Kyler in that he's going from 100% to 75%. It also adds his value in that his head isn't spinning. He's not playing both roles. And when he comes in, he's focused solely on, all right, I'm in man in the slot, or I'm dropping back into safety, or I'm dropping into this or that. It's not as complicated as, okay, I got to know all the man, I got to know all the outside responsibilities. I got to know all the slot responsibilities. It's no, I need my one specific role. And then we have, like I said, the two big long cornerbacks on the outside. And Terrell Smith, my question with Terrell Smith is more of not about, is he going to push Jalen Johnson out? My question is, can he even beat out Kindle Vildor this season? Because one, as much as the Chicago Bears are obviously going to be zone heavy based on, like I said, Tyrique's stats don't skew that way, but his tape definitely shows me he'll be a zone corner. Jalen Johnson is a zone corner, and Terrell Smith, 65 snaps in 2 seasons in man coverage. But he's going to have to play more man coverage than that, if he wants to get on an NFL field. And he's just so raw in that regard. And that's where he is grabby. And that's where in 2019, he got benched because he was giving up too many penalties. And so you saw that, like I said, maybe in specific situations, because they went so zone heavy, because he was able to press the line of scrimmage, because they were able to get more of a pass rush, because the Big Ten quarterbacks that he faced, weren't as daunting. He had a better season. And then, he went to some of those it was, what was it called? The Shrine Bowl. He went to the Shrine Bowl and had a great week, improved his stock to the 5th round. But I'm looking at him and saying, yeah, he is far more raw. He also has some tight hips in terms of change of direction, but he also, sometimes he gets lost, and sometimes he's looking at the quarterback and the ball sailing over his head. So I think he's a complete, unknown in man coverage. And I think he's going to get torched in man coverage early in the preseason. And that's going to take fans' expectations all the way down when he starts getting NFL receivers in the preseason. And then he's still raw. And he said, what kind of zone do the Bears play 2 or 3 high the most? They typically are one of those teams that play, that everybody seems to be shifting more towards, is that 2 high shell coverage, and, keeping everything in front of them and playing that, especially because he has that linebacker in Tremaine Edmonds now. And that's where I keep going back to, he wants to recreate that Indianapolis Colts defense. And when he had Darius Leonard, he needed that same thing. And so instead of getting Darius Leonard, he got himself Tremaine Edmonds, who is just that huge, arms are just so huge, and he just takes away all those passing lanes in the middle of the field. So he is more of that middle of the field robber, and then they run more of a 2 high coverage over the top, and they keep everything in front of them. And that's their biggest mantra, is really to try and avoid the explosive plays. And that's what they were getting sick of Kyler Gordon, is that he was the one, giving up the explosive plays, and Eberflus lives off of keep everything in front of you, keep everything in front of you. And that's where I go back to, I don't think Terrell Smith is, near getting on the field, because he is not going to keep everything in front of him. So, but the Chicago Bears definitely are one of those more of the cover 2, and more. Yeah, it is. Eberflus does have some of those. They're not trying to recreate the Lovie Smith defense from those old Bears days, the Tampa 2 Bears days. But in some regards, Eberflus has ties to Lovie Smith and that defense, and that is what they mainly run. And they run, like I said, they run zone heavy for sure. But and I think some of it you do want to mix it up. And I think that's what helps Kyler Gordon in the slot. And that's what helps Jaquan Brisker, who, like I said, is such a versatile safety, is that you can run that where Brisker's playing high and Gordon's in the slot. And then they kind of at the snap or right before the snap, they can switch. And now Gordon can start to become, instead of being on the outside cornerback, getting torched by, even guys like Alan Lazard and things like that. You just don't want to see that. Now he can be a versatile chess piece. He's not a safety, but because he's a slot cornerback and because the Bears can run that Tampa 2 and because Jaquan Brisker's pretty good, they can start to mix and match things along those lines. And that is where I think they could start to get valuable. So, yeah, any other comments? If anyone wants to take where the chat's going, I think I basically wrapped up what I was saying about Terrell Smith. Just that, I think one, he's still up and down in zone coverage, especially in terms of his instincts. I think he gets away because he has good recovery speed. He's able to press. That buys him a couple seconds of time in some regards. But when the route starts to break, or when when the receiver gets into his second phase, that's where Terrell Smith really starts to get burnt. And that's where I still don't see, when you break it down, Kindle Vildor has been playing special teams in the NFL for a few years now. Terrell Smith, like I said, barely has special teams experience at Minnesota. So I still think, Terrell Smith's biggest obstacle at this point is going to be beating out Kindle Vildor for, basically that fourth cornerback, let alone, and I think, maybe by his second season, he'll be in that fourth cornerback spot. So I don't think he's pushing out Jalen Johnson anytime soon. I think he's pushing out Kindle Vildor, and I think they're hoping by next season, Terrell Smith can be the fourth cornerback who, if we need him to, he can come in for a few snaps. If we have to go really heavy cornerbacks, if somebody gets hurt, by his second season, I think that's the expectation. And the other thing is he's 24 years old. So, I mean, he has no experience in man coverage and he's 24 years old. So, he's not, there's not upside in the project of him other than he is long and fast and things like that. So, it's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do with him. Two other things, just because I don't think we're going to do a Roshan Johnson podcast or anything like that, because I've talked about Roshan a lot in some of these podcasts, and I do have an article coming out talking about the expectations for Roshan, and it's similar to what I talked about for Tyrique Stevenson. I looked at round 4 running backs, and I said, all right, who are some of the best round 4 running backs that if Roshan Johnson wants to be considered one of the better round 4 running backs, he at least needs to be similar to some of these guys? Lamar Miller, Devontae Freeman, Tony Pollard. Ramondre Stevenson is a really good comparison. Marion Barber, Jamal Williams is a really good comparison. Samaje Perine a really good comparison. And then Dameon Pierce, I think you could argue, is a good comparison. But, Pierce got so many carries, and I don't think he's going to get that many carries. They totaled for 127 carries for 525 yards. So I think in some regards, don't get carried away with Roshan. And, if he isn't close to 1,000 yards rushing as a rookie, that in no way impacts him whatsoever. And I think some of the names that, like I said, when I said, oh, that's a really good comparison, Ramondre Stevenson, 133 for 606. I think that would be a great rookie season for Roshan Johnson. Jamal Williams had 153 for 555 or 556. I think that would be a great rookie season. He had 4 touchdowns that season. Samaje Perine, 175 rushes, 600 yards. I think that would be, I think that's along the lines of what you're looking for from a guy like Roshan Johnson this season. And that's why I think it's going to be still, people are saying, oh, Roshan will step in and he'll take over that backfield. I'm saying I think it's going to be at the most a 50-50 split. And maybe by his second season, he'll be able to step into that. And you've seen some of those names were able to, especially, Ramondre stepped into it. Marion Barber really stepped up. Devontae Freeman had a big step up in year 2. But I don't think by his rookie season, and really Dameon Pierce is the only guy, and he didn't have somebody like Khalil Herbert or Dante Foreman. So I think that's, super optimistic. And I think 100 carries is, pretty optimistic for Roshan. And yeah, like he said, he loves Roshan. He may not be a fan favorite, but he puts in the work on special teams and good passer. He's becoming a Chicago Bears fan favorite, honestly. The fans love him. And that's why I almost have to settle down the expectations where people are saying, oh, he's going to step in and take over. He's going to be the man. And I'm saying, I still think Roshan's going to have a really nice season next season. And like he said, you get immediate value out of him. But let's temper the expectations too. Let's expect, 100, 125 carries, 400 to 500 yards. Let's just expect a little something like that. Nothing to get carried away with. And real quickly before we get out of here, Tyler Scott. One of the things I looked at is if you look at day 3 wide receivers, if they don't get, 100 yards, so since 2011, some of the guys who haven't gotten 100 yards and still turned out okay, the best examples, Jakeem Grant, Quincy Enunwa, Isaiah McKenzie, Noah Brown, Cedric Wilson. Those are the best names since 2011 to be drafted on day 3 and not record 100 yards. So Tyler Scott better hope he gets 100 yards. But then even at 100 yards, Josh Reynolds is one of the best names to get 100 yards receiving. Then Braxton Berrios and 200 yards receiving. Marvin Jones got 200 yards. So even if Tyler Scott only gets 200 yards as a rookie, you could point to Marvin Jones and say, okay, that's not bad. But when you look at some of the best receivers from day 3 since 2011, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Darius Slayton, Stephon Diggs, Kenny Stills, Darnell Mooney, Denarius Moore, Hunter Renfrow, Jamison Crowder, Gabriel Davis, Tyreek Hill, Antonio Callaway, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and Martavis Bryant, all of them hit 500 yards. And then you start to go down the list and the players that didn't hit 500 yards. D.D. Westbrook, Equinemius St. Brown, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Travis Benjamin, Jeremy Curley, Kiki Kuti. Like the list, it drops off drastically at 500 yards. It's crazy when you look at it. And like you can barely find receivers drafted on day 3 since 2011 that have any sort of career. But then, like I said, when you list off those top 14 names that I just listed off, some really big hits. But the factor is that they all hit 500 yards as a rookie season. It's going to be interesting for Tyler Scott because he's basically the number 4 receiver. He's supposed to step in for Darnell Mooney, who had 631 yards as a rookie. So it's going to be interesting to see if he can check that. But he has to get at least 200 yards. And I think even as a 4th receiver, you could get 200 yards. And if he's not a 4th receiver by his rookie season, like I said, I mean, times come fast, and if you're a bust pretty quickly. We learn quickly. And even some of these guys got more opportunities, and none of them were able to, take advantage or become, big names after that. And like, I'm really scrolling down the list, and I can't find a single name that I want to point to that didn't get 500 yards. So even if you are drafted on day 3, it's still not going to take long for you to know if you're any good or not. Historically, is what you can see there. So like I said, we're going to start talking about less about the rookies, more about the roster. As OTAs start to come in, we're going to be back on Tuesday. We're going to go weekly by weekly. I think it's going to be a big Justin Fields episode. So if you want to hear me talk Justin Fields, tune in on Tuesday and follow everything I do at Parker Hurley and at beargoggleson.com. And like I said, if you're listening after the fact, comment on YouTube and we'll talk after that. So we'll talk to you guys then.